So in this next section, we are going to move on to, I suppose, more environmental kind of side of the house, a little bit more towards maybe the climate change end of it. So we're going to get into that. So we'll invite the speakers maybe just to come up here up on the stage. We have quite a substantial amount of people on Zoom looking at us at the moment, and I'd be fairly aware if people have told me before, they're probably driving a tractor and looking at the same. So there's health and safety was mentioned here earlier, so just bear that in mind. You know, keep it to the very long straight in the field if you're going to do it. But if you are online, I would really encourage people just to ask questions, throw your question in here, and we'll get it answered for you. So with that, I'm going to invite Dr. Gary Lanigan to come up and give his presentation around the MAC 23 as it pertains to tillage. Gary.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. Today I'm giving a slightly different MAC talk. Most of my MAC talks, probably 9 out of 10 of them tend to be predominantly around livestock and around methane and issues like that. Today is a pleasant change, dealing with tillage, which is actually you'll see an easier sector to reduce emissions in, and in fact a sector which has extremely low emissions anyway. Okay, so why did we have to redo the MAC? We last did it back in 2018. But of course, we have Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act now in force. So we have a legal obligation to reduce agricultural greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by the year 2030. There are also emissions associated in the associated land use change and forestry sector. No target has been set for that as to date, but there will be a decision, I think, imminent. So in terms of the MAC, what we did this time is we looked at different activity scenarios, and that has got a lot of press coverage. I know the different levels of activity weren't done to say that the suckler farmer, there should be less suckler cows or more dairy cows or whatever. It was done just to see what the impact of current socioeconomic and the current policy climates were. Okay. What we did different in the MAC this time was we looked at 2 different levels of ambition, and we very imaginatively called them Pathway 1 and Pathway 2 because we started off saying moderate and ambitious pathway, and then looked at the moderate pathway, and that was actually very ambitious. And we looked at the Pathway 2, and that was actually very, very difficult. So we just called them Pathway 1 and Pathway 2. And the other thing we did this time quite differently is we have different speeds of uptake for different measures. So for newer measures, that would be just kind of hot off the scientific press. We would ramp those up right towards the end of the commitment period, because the commitment period has already started. It's from 2021 to the year 2030. More established methods such as low emission slurry spreading or straw incorporation, you have linear uptake of the measures. We separated out efficiency measures. These don't really pertain to the tillage sector. They're more pertain to the livestock sector, and we took these measures out because while they reduce carbon footprint, they don't necessarily reduce total emissions. And as you will see, most of the measures originally were focused on livestock agriculture, but what I've done is to actually pull out a separate tillage MAC actually from the MAC measures that we have. And we also produced a MAC for land use change, and for the bioenergy sectors. So if you look at agricultural emissions, first thing to note, agricultural emissions are relatively stable. They increased up to 1998, then reduced down to 2011, and then post-quota removal have been on the increase again. But I would note you to the black line. The black line are tillage emissions. Okay. So tillage is about 9% of the utilisable agricultural area. It's between 2.5% and 4.5% of total emissions. So its emission footprint is tiny compared to livestock-based agriculture. And then we have the other sector, which is land use change. And the issue with this sector is this sector's emissions are projected to increase and increase quite substantially over the next 10 years. That's primarily being driven by the lack of afforestation, okay, combined with a lot of peat soils, okay? So the combination of both of those, our emissions in the land use sector are going to rise by about 30 to 40% over the next 10 years. So we have 2 feet that we have to keep cycling with. So very quickly, how to read a MAC. A MAC is actually quite easy to read. The width of the bar tells you how much greenhouse gases are being abated or being stopped by the measure. The height of the bar indicates the cost. And if the bar is below the x-axis, then it's happy days. The measure is actually cost negative, i.e. you gain more money than it costs to implement the measure. Okay, and we came out with this MAC, and it has loads and loads of measures in it, some apply to methane, nitrous oxide, etc. And what we did find was that only the higher uptake pathway would actually get us to where we wanted to go. So we need very, very high rates of uptake to deliver the mitigation. But what about the tillage sector? So if we take all of these measures, how many of these measures pertain to tillage? Oh, sorry. There, not a whole lot. So in fact, a lot of those measures actually are specific to either dairy production or to dry stock production. So what I did was actually then pull out how much the tillage sector itself could reduce emissions, and you can see much the same as the full MAC. This kind of MAC light shows that there's not one single measure that will actually give you a big huge reduction in emissions. The biggest measures are changing fertilizer formulation, straw incorporation, putting in cover crops, and also an expansion of the tillage sector to 400,000 hectares will have the capacity to displace some animals. Okay, so really the big ones: fertilizer formulation going to a protected urea or an ammonia-based compound, use of cover crops, use of straw incorporation, and diversification impacts. Again, there are other things that you can do on farms, such as put in a little bit of forestry, and the department is grant aided. Forestry, you can put in a hectare and you don't need a license to plant. So there are some measures like that. Again, either putting in new hedgerows or actually managing your current hedgerow stock better, again, is quite an effective measure, again, at locking in carbon. So all in all, we found that pathway 1 would deliver for the tillage sector about 345,000 tonnes of reduction for CO2, and under pathway 2, just over 500,000 tonnes, okay? And just to put that into context, that's nearly 50% of tillage's entire emissions from the actual tillage part of the operation. But in terms of the uptake rates of measures and what we're looking at, particularly again for livestock farmers, is we're talking about very, very, very high rates of adoption. We're talking about completely replacing straight urea with protected urea, replacing most of calcium ammonium nitrate with protected urea, and replacing a lot of nitrate-based compounds with ammonium-based compounds, getting up to 85,000 hectares of straw incorporation, 75,000 hectares of cover crops in the ground, getting much more manures onto cropland. Because if you get manures onto cropland, you don't just have the nitrogen benefit, you have an added carbon benefit to the soil. And that added carbon benefit, in turn, then also improves nutrient availability in those soils. Okay, and again, you can put in some some small amount of forestry, or really one thing to focus on, I would say, for tillage farmers is better hedgerow management. Okay, hedgerow management for not a whole lot of cost can deliver an awful lot of gain in terms of sequestering more carbon within the hedgerow biomass. Then again, we looked at bioenergy. Again, for the tillage sector, it's only marginal. We did look at the use of some annual or perennial crops for heat or electricity, and that could deliver again about 200,000 tonnes of reduction. The only thing there is it's contributing to the energy sector's offset rather than to agriculture. And one thing that comes up a lot, and I'll end at this point, and that is, well, if we go and have more tillage, surely we're ploughing a permanent pasture and we're releasing loads of carbon, etc. And that's true if you go on the wrong soils, but most of our tillage soils tend to be on brown earths. And in fact, a lot of those soils were previously used for tillage. So, you know, we have about 350,000 hectares of land that transitions in and out of tillage. Plus with the brown earths, if you put that back into tillage, you're not going to actually lose a whole lot of carbon. So you can actually expand the tillage area without having a huge impact on soil carbon. So the key messages: tillage emissions are very low, okay? Somewhere between about 2.5 to 4.5% of emissions, depending on how you count the nitrous oxide emissions. Of course, getting reductions across all of the sectors is going to require increased advisory and extension services, and we'll hear about that next from the Signpost Farms. If you look at some of the levels of uptake, particularly on the fertilizer side, that's required. You know, increased advisory knowledge transfer is not going to be enough. Okay, it will require policy and incentives. Reductions in tillage emissions equates to, I said here almost 40%, but in fact it's almost 50% of tillage's total agriculture and land use emissions. So tillage can reduce emissions very significantly. Energy substitution can contribute towards energy sector decarbonisation. And then again, for both the tillage sector in terms of what we heard about integrated pest management earlier, but also in terms of finding, again, novel slow release fertilizers, etc., and also building up soil carbon, continued R&D will be required for reaching 2050 targets. Thank you.
Gary, thanks very much for that. Look, we have time for a question or two if anybody wants to throw it in online.
Yeah, there's one here online. Gary, is crop establishment system not effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or were they considered? Were those systems considered?
You're talking about the tillage method, is it?
Tillage method.
Yeah, well, you'll know this better than I will, Dermot. What we have found is that if you go to minimum tillage, you get more soil organic carbon in the top 10 to 20 centimeters. But when you look across the entire plough layer depth, you know, say down to 30 centimeters, 35 centimeters, and what you see is that in the inversion tillage system, you simply redistribute the carbon. Actually, we didn't find any significant difference between min-till versus inversion ploughing.
Don't see any other hands up, but Gary, I'm just going to throw in one at you. We're quite low in terms of the total amount of carbon emissions from the tillage sector.
Yeah.
How easy is it for us to get to carbon zero or carbon neutral?
For the tillage sector, I would say and I'll always say this, on paper it always looks easy, but it's far easier for a tillage farm to get carbon neutral than it will be for any of the livestock farms, be it cattle rearing, sheep rearing, dairy. So in fact, simply by applying most of the measures that we have for tillage in terms of manures, in terms of cover crops, straw incorporation, then managing your hedgerows better. A combination of those will probably nearly get you about 75% of the way, I'd say, maybe even more.
Well, that's certainly a big selling point for the tillage sector, certainly in that. And I think that's a huge thing that the drinks industry in particular are probably looking for. We do have just one question here before we go.
I realise I should probably know the answer to this question. I'm going to ask you anyway, Gary. But we've got cover crops in the MAC, and obviously it takes a long time to produce a MAC. Yeah. And I guess in the intervening period, we've had compulsory shallow cultivation post-harvest. And as I believe it, that produces nearly as much biomass as a sown cover crop. So what do you think? I mean, we've got 75,000 hectares there of cover crop being established, but I would say we've probably already exceeded that if we include green cover from shallow cultivation.
You could, absolutely. And again, I suppose Richie would tell you if he was here. Like, you know, with getting good green cover in terms of volunteer growth, you know, getting that disturbance in early, right after harvesting is really what counts. But yeah, some of the work that Richie's done on that, and we analysed the soil carbon, and there was very little difference between the cover crop and a very good natural regeneration.
Okay, we're just going to take one from Alan, and then we're going to come back to Gary again after that at the end of the session.
Thank you, Chairman. I just would like to mention insects, bacteria, fungi, and nematodes, which myriads of which make up each handful of soil. And to look at soils and measure the organic carbon or organic matter, that's two aspects of the soil. But the health, the actual health of the soil in terms of the population of those terribly important symbiotic creatures that are in the soil, I believe we as farmers, and I'm speaking as a humble farmer, need to know more about what actually is happening underneath the surface and the effect on our soils of the things that up to now we have been told to throw at it, irrespective of whatever may happen, to get yields up. And that is not the whole story. I would make a plea for a little bit more research, rather more research on soils, and also the dissemination of that information to farmers and how we ought to treat our soils. And can I finish with one simple example? I've been farming, tillage farming, for 65 years on the same piece of ground, and I'm detecting a level of deterioration in my yields. Now, I can get the yields up by stuffing nitrogen on, but that's not the way to do it. I recently removed a small piece of hedge, bank, fence, call it what you like, between two fields. And they were, both sides then were sown simultaneously, cultivated and simultaneously sown with a catch crop last month. And the actual take on that segment of land, which was about 3 yards wide by about 50 yards long, is incredibly better on the area of hedge that was removed than the rest of the farms that I've been farming to the best of my ability for over 6 decades. Okay, I think there's a message there, Chairman.
Thank you very much for your comment. We'll take it as a comment, and just in terms of the time that we have. I suppose the first thing to say is I hope you plan to double that hedge back in again, because you kind of do have to do that. But apart from that, look, we have a big soils program which is looking at exactly that, all aspects of soil health, and that's ongoing in Johnstown Castle, and we're putting certainly more resources to that within Teagasc. So Gary, thanks for that. I'll ask you to come back again afterwards. So we're going to keep going because we are under serious time pressure here. I'm going to invite John Mann, who's the tillage signpost farm advisor, to build on some of the things that Gary pointed to in his presentation around, you know, how do we action some of these measures that we're looking at. John? Oh. Okay, John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Michael. Good afternoon, everyone. For for both my presentation and the following one, we're combined in two. We have Darren Allen, one of our signpost tillage farmers, going to speak on some of the actions he's doing on farm, and he's working at down in County Cork. So just to begin my presentation, I'm speaking on the signpost program itself. It's probably one of the biggest undertakings Teagasc has ever taken on. It's a multi-annual program to lead climate change and introduce some of the measures that have been introduced in the MAC that Gary spoke about to lead climate change towards our targets for 2030. But before I do, I'd really like to bring it back to there's so much stuff coming at us every time, and I think the word sustainability to me is more important, that we really need to start at the beginning with sustainability. Now, there are three parts to sustainability: the environment, but both the economic and social aspect are kind of forgotten about a little bit more. So there's a lot of push and a lot of dictation to get the environment right, but to me, as an agronomist and a farmer, the economic aspect has to come into play and is really important, and actually the social part as well, because there's no point in the word bearable is there, but there is no point in just farming for the sake of it. You must enjoy your work as well. So I think it's really important, and as I said, it's like the three-legged stool there. Nothing can go on without the other. So just to bring it back to the signpost program itself, as I say, it's a multi-annual program. The one thing to say about it, it's a major program. It's a massive program, but it is not Teagasc's program. It's an industry-wide program. There's over 60 partners and organizations involved with the signpost program, and they're on steering groups, and they're on different ways that they're getting their message across into the signpost program. So Teagasc is just there to lead it, but it's an industry program, and that's really important to know. Just I have on the right hand side there, it's kind of divided into three parts. The three parts are interlinked. There's the signpost demonstration farmers, which I'll speak about in a second, and I'm involved in. We also have an advisory campaign, and some of the advisors are down at the foyer area for later on if you want to have a look and chat with them. And then there's also the research for the carbon sequestration, which is feeding into it. So it's a multi-layered approach that's interacting. From the demonstration farms point itself, there are over 120, it's about 126 demonstration farms out there. That is just not, there's nowhere in Europe has something like that going on at the minute. And you can see on the map there how diverse it is, both in enterprise and also how every part of the country is nearly covered. So just bear that in mind, that when you hear or read about signpost, it's a really massive structure of demonstration farms out there. With that, I suppose the important part is that advisors like myself work with their local advisors, and we're going to be there to co-create plans, and it's a cross-pollination between ideas with the farmers and ourselves as to what mitigation actions and plans that we bring into play. And that's really important, because it's not something that we force on them, because not every measure that we come up with, like cover crops, may not suit one particular farmer that's doing all winter cereals and sowing early with a min-till or a no-till system. So it has to be suitable for the farm, and not every measure will be suitable for every farm. So again, we're building it together, and that's the most important part of it. When we implement the measures, there's strong monitoring in the demonstration farms in the background, and that's really important to bring back the data. And that data then is used, and that's the strong background to building all of the other ideas that will come out in a wider audience. So again, and I just see on the right-hand side there, share their experience. So Darren will share his experiences with us today. I'm just putting this slide quickly up. It's there's quite a lot on it, but it's a continuous improvement situation. We start with the planning at the bottom. We implement the plan on the farm. We monitor what goes on. We take our measurements, and there's a lot of measurements goes on, and an awful lot of measurements. Then we benchmark that against the average of a group and the average for the country. And feeding into that will be the likes of the research that's coming from the MAC and different aspects as well. Up on the top right there, we have a sustainability digital platform, which I'll speak about in a minute. But the top left there, the most important thing is there's not much point in knowing all this and not being able to get it out there. So it's really important that we have a farmer-to-farmer learning experience with it. Of those 120 plus farmers, we have 10 of them are devoted to the tillage signpost program. And they're fairly well scattered throughout the tillage area in Ireland. But the one thing I would like to say about these is we have a very varied nature, and that's on purpose. We have different crop establishment systems from plough to min-till to no-till. We have guys growing, about 6 of them are growing malt and barley. Some are growing potatoes. Others are all winter cereals. Some are mainly spring cereals. So there's a lot of variety in there. I'll point out 3, the coloured ones there. We have an organic farm down in Wexford. So that's an entirely different program, obviously, to some of the others. We have the use of organic manures there on a large scale beef enterprise in County Meath. And we have one large scale pig farmer in Offaly and Croghan. And both of those were majoring on reusing in-crop spreading onto winter corn in March time for the first split of nitrogen. And again, the most important thing with all of this is it's not much point in us doing all the work. I'd run demonstrations on these farms and will be going forward over the next number of years. And it's important that, you know, that you're not actually just looking at the one local to you, that there might be something really, really important based on some other aspect that you're interested in but don't know anything about. So be prepared to travel if you can. And I'll give a plug here now to next Thursday. I've a big field event in Don Summers Farm down in Oilgate in Wexford. And we'll have researchers from Oak Park and Johnstone Castle at that. So you're most welcome. And that's a free event. It's a field event. We'll have test pits and lots of stuff going on with organics and cover crops, and precision farming is Don's speciality. So we'll be majoring on that as well. So do use these farms. Again, I'm just going to bring it back to what was said earlier and the MAC curve. I've circled 4 of the measures there, and again, it's great to see the work that's been done and that there are tillage measures being brought into it again. Again, as outlined, above the line costs money and below the line doesn't. So some of those are below the line and are going to save you money. But I would, the two above the line that I have circled there, strong corporation and hedgerows, strong corporation measure with funding, which has been fully taken up this year, that has to be encouraged because it's a really, really good measure and cost effective if you can get funding. Hedgerows, again, in acre schemes and stuff like that, but there should be more funding in that. And I say that this week where we finish hedgerow week, and just on that, there's a really, really good podcast on last night with Catherine Keenan as well. So I'm going to ask the question, and I think it was almost answered already. Can Irish tillage farms become carbon neutral? And in my opinion, with a little bit of fine tuning, we can get very close to it. And yeah, Gary has already outlined that. So in the tillage program itself, we have KPIs. They're there. we're going to minimize greenhouse gas emissions, water quality. But to me, the most important one is the financial sustainability, because if you're not in business, you're not going to survive. On the carbon sequestration, there's a number of projects ongoing. That's to build up carbon data on the farms, and that will be building into the models that Gary will be working with. So for yourselves, just to finish up, there are two main actions, I suppose. There's a sheet on the seat there, which is a sustainability self-assessment sheet. Bring it home with you, fill it out, and you get a kind of half idea how well you're doing. Many of the measures you're doing them anyway, and we have 12 steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Finally, on the advisory program, there are advisors out there on the farm to deal with all farmers. There's a Know My Number campaign. It's up and running for dairy and beef, and in development for the tillage sector. It's free service to everyone. And AgNav is the tool that they're using, which is an all-Irish tool, which is being built. And again, this will be expanded over time as data comes in, but it's a data capture engagement with farmers to bring it around. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Darren. Darren will go through what he's doing on the farm, and we'll take questions afterwards. But I would like to just thank all of our partners, and particularly Drinks Ireland and Tillage Industry Ireland, who are the main sponsors of Signpost Tillage. I'll hand over to Darren now.
That's great. Thanks very much, John. And we will take questions at the end. So Darren, I will just get you to come straight through. Yeah, just keep clicking through. Maybe just use down arrow or the cursor. Down arrow, can get you there. Use the down arrow. Perfect.
Hello, how are you? Darren Allen's my name. I'm farming the grounds of Ballymoo House. We're farming 125 hectares. We're heavy clay loam soils over limestone. It's a tillage enterprise that we have. We keep a couple of outdoor pigs, a couple of hens for the hotel use. Other enterprises that we have are contract grain drying, self-catering apartments, event centres. The crop grown on our farm this last year were winter wheat, malting barley, beans, oilseed rape, and we grew rye for the first time there last year. On the farm, machinery, I do the spraying and the fertilizer spreading and the light cultivations ourselves. I find it really important just to be out on the crops and to see that and to see what's going on. Whereas I leave a lot of the heavier work to contractors, the harvesting, the planting and organic manure applications. Organic manures, we've been using pig slurries and cattle slurries on the farm for a good 2 years now. You can see there we were spreading it there on March that was, and there's very little damage. With GPS, the umbilical system and the dribble bars, they do a really good job of getting it out. It's very, very accurate, very impressive. You can see in the middle picture there where we had a miss there. You can see the end take up of pig slurry there in that particular year on top of wheat. We're putting pig slurry out for the soil, and it's all about the plants. It's all about the roots under the plants. It's all about the what's in the ground, and that's why we're kind of doing it. There's a lot in the slurry that's beyond what comes out of a bag. The field, the bigger picture here of us standing in the middle of it, you can see that's the same field that we were spreading the slurry later on in the year, and there was virtually no damage done to it. You never notice any damage in the fields. The thing about slurry is the logistics of it. You're dealing with pig farms and their quarantine systems. You're dealing with lorries. You're dealing with transport. You're dealing with spreading contractors. You're dealing with growth states of your crop. You're dealing with weather, trafficability. It's a lot to take on. It's not for the faint-hearted, and it's best to give as much of that responsibility to someone else as you kind of can. Also, I've suffered in the past where we might be taking slurries from different tanks on different farms or same farms, and they'd have a different nitrogen within them, and it's grand to test it, but actually you have it on the land before you get a result back. So it's a great idea. We have been using protected urea, or we've been using urea on the land for going back 20 years now, I'd say. I was using normal urea. We're spreading it out to 24-meter tram lines. There's a great push at the moment to use protected urea. For me, it's just more expensive. I'm told I get a better result, but I've never quantified it for myself on my own land. If it's such a valuable thing, maybe it should be sponsored a little bit by or financed some way, if that's where they want us to go as farmers. We've also been looking and trialing a little bit of melting ureas for appliquing for taking for foliar feeds. I'm not sure where I stand on that yet, but we're looking at it anyway. Last year, under the signpost agreement, we took a wheat field and we tried different cultivation techniques. We tried different fertilizer techniques. On the left-hand side, it's ploughed one pass. There's a little section where it's min-tilled. Then we move on to a strip till, which the rest of the field was. We were comparing protected urea, pig slurry, Teagasc, blue N, foliar N, and we both took samples. The Teagasc haven't come back to me with what their samples were. We took tramline samples when we were cutting it and put an area on it. But there was a substantial financial saving. There was a substantial fertilizer usage depending on which measure we took. And there was quite a variance in profit over that field too when we actually went into the nuts and the bolts of it. It's an area where me as a farmer, I'm finding it very hard to get information about what works, what doesn't work, why does it work, how does it work, will it work? And the one trial that we didn't do there was we didn't try can, which would have been really interesting, just for the comparison. Before that crop of wheat, we had a very strong cover crop. There's that's the root structures that we're trying to get. We're definitely with the strip tilling, we're starting to change. Let's see where I'm going. We're starting to look at our soil differently. We're digging holes. We're looking at what's going on underneath. We're counting worms. I've been in strip tilling for maybe 2 years. This year, possibly half my farm will be strip tilled. But for the soil and for the whole way of thinking, it's not just a matter of a different drill. It's actually it's led me down a really interesting journey. And one thing is I can sit in my tractor seat when I go across it. It's not so rough after the plough. Other measures that we are doing on our farm are we're cover crops under the acres. We've riparian zones. We've planting new hedgerows. We've straw incorporation. We have the bird feed margins. We have space for nature. We're part of acres, and we've also got a plan with national parks and wildlife services. And that little bit of money coming in sometimes can be your best paying hectares on your worst little parcel of land. And we've used that to kind of build bigger margins where we were having water run off our fields. And the life of the smaller bird around the place has just exploded with the use of this and the previous bird feed margins. I'm a big fan of that. For signpost moving forward, my main thing is to stay financially stable. And there was a lot of talk here today about what we can do and how much better it is. The way I read into a lot of that and the way that I work with a lot of that is I just take it as pointers. I try it. If it's easier, if it's cheaper, I run with it. If it's a headache, I shy away from it. But I'm not doing too bad because I filled out this sustainability and I got full marks on it. So I'm obviously okay. So I'm doing okay. Another thing that we've discovered is my farm was incredibly poor on data logging, on knowing what fields were strong, what yields I was getting. If I did X, what does it mean? And so I'm working a lot more with them on the signpost or on the gatekeeper program, working with my agronomist there on that. And we're getting some really interesting information, and it's a lot cheaper than the combined field monitor or weigh bridges, which give you kind of averages. I plan to keep a really diverse rotation. When we had sugar beet, we had a big rotation. After the sugar beet, we kind of went back to just wheat. Our yields suffer, and now we've got a big diverse rotation of cereals, brassicas, pulses, winter, spring, and keeping a real diversity of roots, living roots in the ground is another thing that I'm trying to work on. I'm looking at reducing cultivation. I'm seeing soil health building because of that. And when I'm seeing that soil health, I'm starting to ask questions. Can I reduce my plant protection products that I'm having to buy? And just really asking questions. They're so expensive, is probably the thing. And we've been doing trials on nitrogen efficiency, and we'll continue doing that. Other sustainable things we have, we use a lot of power with the hotel and the farm. So we have 147 kilowatts of PV panels up on our grain store. They're brilliant. Just put them up. They're fantastic. We have a biomass boiler that we heat the hotel with, and in this late summer there, we actually have spare capacity, and we dry a lot of grain with it. That is ran on the straw that we harvest off our land, particularly our wheat. We bale it up, and we have a boiler that can handle it. We have schemes where we have beehives and owl boxes. For our guests, we actually offer nature walks around the place where there's huge interest. People love that. The people love to get back to nature. We've agroforestry. We're one of those people who got ash plantations and dealing with ash dieback and not knowing which way to go and hoping something will come our way that will make it worth doing something with. Acres National Parks. That's an interesting one. We got approached to join the National Parks and Wildlife, and we've done some really, really interesting things with them. And I believe that they're looking to expand. They've money to go to more farmers and things like that. They're definitely worth a look if this is the way you're kind of thinking. And we've had some open days for the Signpost project. Thank you from all in Ballymaloe, and we're having a bit of crack there.
Great, thanks very much, Darren. In fairness, you've been really efficient with time. I expect you to go a little bit more than that, and we were very hard on you at the very start. We pulled out slides that you wanted to talk about. So, is there any questions from the floor or maybe online? And while you're kind of thinking of that, Darren, I just wanted to ask you one question around oilseed rape. We pulled a slide on you. You wanted to talk about oilseed rape. What are your plans for oilseed rape in terms of how you're going to manage that during the year?
We've been growing oilseed rape for a long time. We have up to date, we would spread pig slurry on the ground, we would plow it down, and I'd be really anxious to get that plowed into the ground within an hour to keep all the nitrogen there. We would then grow just our spring using that growth stage regulator thing to decide how much fertilizer more we will top that up, and it can vary quite a bit. This year we're shifted to the strip till, put a cattle slurry down there. I've never used cattle slurry before, so it's kind of just a learning thing. But this year actually I'm going to put companion crops in with my oilseed rape. I'm going to divide my field into 3 different sections. Conventionally, I'm going to have a companion cropping, and I'm actually going to put a companion cropping where I'm going to inoculate the seed with the biological stimulants to see if I see anything from that. That's my plan this year.
Okay, so thanks very much. I'm going to open up the floor to Gary, John, and Darren as well for any questions that you might have. So throw them at me if you have one there. Gary, I just wanted to come back to you for a second, just while I'm waiting for a few questions from the floor. So throw up your hands if you want, and certainly to the Zoom audience as well. If you have a question, throw it out. Gary, there's some talk over the last couple of weeks around carbon storage on farms and the payment of that carbon. Where do you think that is really going to go?
I don't know. Certainly, I know there's a lot of enthusiasm at EU level to bring in carbon farming systems. What I would say is we want to be very careful, because unless we've actually measured it properly first, you know, your and the land use change inventory at the moment is in quite, I would think, quite an immature state. And so, for example, if I you know, tell farmer A that by growing cover crops he'll sequester X tons of carbon, you know, unless we've got good measurements for that, you know, and it turns out that it's only half that amount, a market will lose integrity very, very quickly unless you've got good measurements. Now, on the tillage side, actually turns out that's probably the part of the land use inventory that will change the quickest. So probably in the next year or so, we'll be changing the tillage the cropland inventory to be able to incorporate some of these measures like cover cropping, straw incorporation, manures, etc. It's the grassland side of the house that's got incredibly large ranges of soil carbon and carbon sequestration or carbon loss associated with it. And I would be very, very uneasy about starting a market based on soil carbon before we've properly measured it.
Okay, thank you. Dermot, thank you. You have a question or two from Zoom?
Yeah, there was two. There was one a little bit earlier, and it's a shorter one for Gary, and then there's another one that might set the scene later. But the question for Gary, I think, is why is land use change so influential, if you like? Is land use actually changing, or are all the areas not constant? In other words, why is it rearing its head?
And on the whole, most of we call it land use change and forestry. So it covers all the different land uses. Land use change, again, yeah, there's not a huge amount of land that goes from one, that transitions from one land use to the other. The largest one that you see changes in is in forestry, generally, or in wetlands. But it's becoming important because there is a tranche of unallocated emissions under the Climate Action Plan, and there's been no target set for the LULUCF sector, but it's turning out very, very quickly, both from analysis we've been doing, but also analysis from the EPA, etc., that it's a highly uncertain sector, and setting targets, or very hard targets for it, is going to be quite difficult.
Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands coming up at all. Everyone's very quiet on the carbon side of it. John, we jumped across, or you jumped across probably because I was encouraging you to jump kind of a bit quicker, but we jumped across a little bit in terms of some of the measurements on the signpost farms around that carbon bit. You might just explain one or two of the kind of the big things that we're trying to do on those farms to try and assess that carbon stocks.
Yeah, so Michael, on the signpost, all of the demonstration farms across the board, including the tillage ones, there are a number of research projects ongoing there, and I suppose the whole idea is to try and capture in minute detail the data from the carbon release on those farms, and then all of that data will be gathered together to aid what Gary's work is doing, and come up with better models, which will feed into the likes of the AgNav for tillage when it's available. So some of those measures, like LiDAR flights, are happening at the moment, which is a technology with a drone where it's measuring the quality and the quantity of hedgerows and tree lines on farm. So again, the carbon capture from that particular aspect. There's a very, very deep soil program ongoing. You have your normal soil sampling at 4 centimeters, but there's also a deep soil sampling going on at 60 centimeters as well, and various depths, where they're measuring the soil carbon and the soil organic matter in those. So that's ongoing at the end of the day.
So we'll basically end up, John, with the stocks that's in the, if you like, growing in hedges, in forests and whatever's on the farm, but also the stocks that are involved in the soils to depth, regardless of cultivation system to start.
Absolutely, and that's across the board. There's just one other part of it, just Michael, before we go. The National Farm Survey data collectors are on farm as well, so it's really important that the financial details are being captured as well. So to put a cost analysis on a lot of what's happening on farm as well. So that's really important.
We have one question over here, but I'm going to go to Dermot. You said there's another question. We've another question back down here.
There was one kind of very general one came in here. I think, Michael, you were worried about safety and the tractor. I said this fella went straight over the ditch with the cultivator still in the ground when he was listening to Gary, but he pulled the handbrake and rode this anyhow. So he said the tillage sector is undoubtedly the least environmentally damaging agri-sector from an emission point of view. Yet why, despite lots of political talk, is it being continually being squeezed out just so the national dairy herd can be maintained or increased? We are in effect being sacrificed. On top of that, the tillage farmer has been encouraged to change to offset emissions from that very dairy sector. It might set the scene for the end.
We'll take it as a comment rather than anything we can answer, and we'll I'd like to say we'll get the panel maybe to have a go at that at the end. Okay, we have a question here, John.
Yeah, just one for Darren. You mentioned that you'd switched over, or you'd moved a few years ago to straight urea, and you mentioned about protected urea, and you kind of had for the public good. I mean, I think one of the risks with straight urea is that, particularly in hotter and drier weather, that you can lose quite a lot of the nitrogen to the atmosphere, and that's what the protection on the protected urea stops or slows down. Have you seen any problems, particularly in hotter years or drier years, with the urea and poor nitrogen use efficiency? I can't tell you what the figures are in terms of losses, Gary could, but I'm just wondering, have you tried protected urea or have you seen problems with straight urea?
I've been using urea for a long time. I went through a lot of learning about how to spread it, how to get it wide, equipment to use it, types of days that you spread it in. I think with slurry, I think you talk about the day that the windscreen is on intermittent. And when I've done it with that, with ureas, I was very, very happy with the results. I wouldn't spread it on a hot sunny day. I've often had it there in the bag and gone for something else because the weather wasn't there, and then gone back to it later on. I've seen that firsthand, and you can lose it, but you have to be clever about using it.
Okay. Right, look, we're pretty much bang on time. We don't have a huge amount more questions coming here. So look, it's just up to me now to thank both Darren, John, and Gary very much for their time and presentations. There was a huge amount in that, so you might give them a round of applause, please.